Hello and welcome to another episode of Inside Infrastructure, an inside look at the decisions and decision makers behind Australia's city-shaping infrastructure. I'm Ilya Zak from series sponsor PwC Australia, and I'll be joined for the main portion of our show by my co-host Adrian Dwyer, CEO of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. First up though, we want to thank everyone for the incredible reception for our last episode. It was very widely shared on social media channels, which is a handy reminder to please continue sharing, and also make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you happen to listen. For today's show, Adrian and I spoke to our first international guest for the series, Bernard Tabary, CEO of Keolis International. Quick side note, Bernard, if you're listening, I apologise for that pronunciation, but I'm confident that my attempt at a French accent would have been much more offensive. Keolis is one of the world's largest integrated transport companies, providing transport services in one form or another on 4 continents, with a significant portion of that activity occurring in Australia as well. In addition to being a hugely interesting person in his own right, as CEO of all of Keolis' operations outside of France, Bernard also has an unmatched level of insight on how various public transport procurement and service delivery systems compare internationally, and he very generously shared those thoughts with us when we sat down with him just a few weeks ago. So without further ado, here he is, Bernard Tabary.
So Bernard Tabary, welcome to Inside Infrastructure. Thanks for joining us. I thought it might be useful as our first ever international guest on this podcast if you could maybe tell us who you are and what you do.
Yes, with pleasure. Well, thank you for your hospitality in this beautiful place overlooking Darling Harbour and such a fast-changing environment. It's absolutely amazing. Well, look, I started after a couple of years in the French Navy, in the submarine forces, and I was in love with shipping, so I worked in container shipping.
We are very definitely going to come back to your time in the Navy as a submariner. That's good.
Perfect. Well, I went into container shipping, and for my great luck, the company I was with, which was a French shipping company, decided to purchase a company called Australia-New Zealand Direct Line, a subsidiary of the Shipping Corporation of New Zealand, which was operating ships between Australia, New Zealand and North America. And they were headquartered in Los Angeles, and since they needed they wanted to have a Frenchman in the operation that spoke English. I knew nothing about Australia or New Zealand or North America, but at least I spoke English. So I moved to LA and was busy for 7 years working on that trade between North America and Australia and New Zealand.
When was this, sorry?
That was between 89 and 96. So, yeah, many, many years ago. But it was New Zealand had reformed and was privatizing. That's when Shipping Corporation of New Zealand was sold. And that's when Australia was looking at, opening up the Trans-Tasman and envisaging or looking towards waterfront reform, which it did a few years after. And in those days, I was seeing Australia looking up to New Zealand on reform that had taken place in New Zealand, but not yet in Australia. And I was lucky to live here for a couple of years and really enjoyed it thoroughly, and saw a country which was so pleasant to live in, an environment which was so positive. So a very good memory of these days, which ended. Basically, we were about to purchase A&L from the Australian state when the Jacques Chirac decided to resume the nuclear tests, and that put an end to the project of the purchase of A&L, and prompted my return to the parent office.
You didn't want to stay for the
France.
Nuclear tests?
I didn't. No, but I remember my staff demonstrating in front of the French consulate in Market Street, and encouraging me to join them, which was, having been in the submarine forces, a double embarrassment. Anyhow, it was there was real tension at the time, and it was understandably a very strong concern for the Australians to have that, and felt, look, if it's so harmless, why don't you hold those tests in the Atlantic Ocean next to Brest? Anyhow, that's going back a long time in history, but it gave me a good appreciation of the environment here, which I knew. And after 17 years in shipping, Left shipping to work in, having returned to France, in a plastic manufacturing company, tier one automotive supplier for the, which also had an environment division, which I ran. And through that, I learned to live or to work with municipalities. And having done 17 years in container shipping and 5 years working with the municipalities, it was logical that I would move to Keolis, which operates, public transport networks for municipalities. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years, half of which on the French side, and now for the last 8 years on the international side, which gave me a chance to come back to Australia. So this is the current position that I hold is one where I oversee the activities of Keolis, which are outside France, and that brings me here regularly with enthusiasm.
So everything outside of France is the international
yes
business?
That's how we are split up. And basically Keolis today is about 6 billion euros in revenue. It's about 65,000 staff, and it's half and half between what's in France and what is outside France.
And you're based out of London?
I'm based in Paris,
and
on planes.
Yeah.
It is an enormous global operation. Can you talk us through, because I was looking through the maps, it's incredible how many different places it's operating in. Can you talk us through some of the locations, because there's all the cities in France and then also East Asia, and now it's growing in Australia as well?
Keolis started in France, logically, where we ran, we still run public transport networks for municipalities like Lyon, like Lille, like Rennes, like Tours, like Dijon, like Bordeaux. And in those cities, the municipalities hand over the management of their public transport network as a whole, i.e. all the modes, and they challenge the operator at the time of the bid to come up with the lowest cost structure as well as the highest potential revenue. And they basically judge the winner of the bid on the winner's ability to maximize the revenue and minimize the costs.
The operator takes revenue risk in those?
The operator takes the revenue risk. The operator doesn't set the fares. That's a political decision. We go to tenders. We don't go to elections.
Right.
But we do take the revenue risk, and therefore we were encouraged in those contracts to set the alarm clock half an hour earlier, because we have not only to cut costs but also to ensure that the network is clean, that it is safe, of course, that it is user-friendly, that it reaches out to all categories, to tourists, etc., so that we maximize the revenue. And it has, if you like, influenced our DNA in as much as we therefore are very passenger focused rather than mode focused. In those networks we will operate subways, tramways, buses, ferries, etc. But in the end we are passenger centric and mode agnostic, i.e. for us the mode is a mean to an end. The end is the attractiveness of the city, and how successful the network is in helping the city develop its agenda. Now we are very clear. We do not define strategy. We execute strategy. The strategy is defined by the city, by the local public transport authority. Again, they decide on the fares, they decide on the routes, they put their network out to tender, and the one that comes up with the best response gets the win.
Can I ask about that? Because it's this really interesting model in France, because Keolis is owned by SNCF.
Keolis has
part owned 70%, I think, and so are there other effectively government-owned operators that are competing against you for a French government contract?
Well, indeed, from the distance it may look strange. First of all, Keolis was not always majority owned by SNCF. When I joined Keolis, it was owned by 3i, a British private equity fund, which had the majority shareholding, and SNCF had the minority, and that stayed on for many years until SNCF brought to Keolis its parking activity, which it felt could be managed better by Keolis, which we took over, and bringing that to Keolis, they became the majority shareholder. But we've always had, and for the last 12 years, we've also had CDPQ. Now, CDPQ, Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, is a huge fund with managing over 300 billion Canadian dollars in assets, of which probably 100 in infrastructure, or more in infrastructure, and therefore we are a private company, and on our board. In fact, all the board committees are chaired by representatives from CDPQ, and that's in the shareholders agreement between CDPQ and SNCF to ensure for CDPQ to feel comfortable that they were just not going to deploy French governmental policies, but what was good for the company. The company is run as a private company. Now, for the networks that we operate in France, the networks are owned by cities, not by the French state. So it's not the same regime. Yeah, it's not the same level of government. We have the benefit of having SNCF as a majority shareholder because they have a strong transport expertise. They have a very focused transport approach, and they manage, 15,000 trains a day and a big high-speed and regular train, 30,000 kilometer train network in France, of which 3,000 kilometers of high speed. But SNCF are very happy to have us as a subsidiary because we are in the world of competition. 100% of the business that we manage is won through tenders. We don't have 1% of our business that would come just from a government award or anything. And for SNCF, which is going to be faced with competition more and more, it's a good learning experience. So I know it comes across as it may come across as an odd setting, but it works well, and hopefully, and it delivers.
I just want to step back for a moment. You spoke about the multimodal concept, and that's what is operating in Newcastle that Keolis Downer operate here. There might be people listening to this podcast who are maybe on a bus or a light rail or a tram somewhere and don't know that that's operated by you guys. So I wonder if you could just tell us about the Australian operations and what you operate here.
Indeed. Well, we often, more often than not, do not operate under our name because legitimately the city or the PTA wants the name of its network and not necessarily the name of its operator. And that's fully understandable, and therefore people will not know where we operate. We were lucky to come into Australia first in Melbourne, where we operate Yarra Trams for Public Transport Victoria, and that's been for the last 10 years. So people see Yarra Trams and they do not know that Keolis Downer is the proud operator of the network, since we have a joint venture and have had a joint venture from the start with Downer, a great partner here in Australia. After that, we moved into the Gold Coast, where we operate the Gold Coast Light Rail, which we won as a contract early on in its construction. And then, so we work with we work with the state of Queensland there, and we also operate we've purchased jointly with Downer an Australian bus company called ATE, which has now been renamed KD Bus, and they operate in Brisbane, in Adelaide, in Perth, and with KD Bus, we have won the contract of Newcastle, which you were referring to, where for Transport for New South Wales, we operate the integrated network, because Transport for New South Wales have decided to try that sort of a new contractual approach where the operator is charged with revenue and with costs. And in Newcastle, we operate both the buses as well as the tram, as well as the ferries and the on-demand.
What does that do? Having an integrated, a single franchise for a geographic area. What does that improve for the customer?
Well, for the customer, the benefit hopefully is that first she will have a seamless travel, i.e. Same ticketing, same branding of the network, same signage, but also if one mode is suffering, then the substitution by another mode is going to be fluid and immediate because it is operated by the same company. And he will have, what's important to a passenger is what? First and foremost, safety. And that sounds trite, but it takes work to indeed guarantee that day in, day out, particularly on modes that are perhaps less safety conscious than, rail is very safety conscious, perhaps less so than aviation, but rail is very safety conscious. And as you go further into the chain, there hasn't been the same safety approach, say, on buses. Well, for passengers, delivering that safety is critical. So beyond that safety focus, having that focus consistently on on-time performance, cleanliness, etc., and a consistency of approach and feel for the network, I think brings benefits to the passengers. The ultimate judge of that, of course, is patronage, and you look at the trend.
So how is it manifested in the patronage? Have you seen growth?
Well, the great news on that, we need a level of humility also, i.e., we operate in a system in a general environment. And basically, the director of the play or the show is the Public Transport Authority. We are one of the cast members. We may be an important one, but we work to a tune that is set by the PTA. So whenever referring to successes in Newcastle, I wouldn't put everything on the operator and its skills, because the state has decided to invest the proceeds of the sale of the port into the rejuvenation of the city. There's been heavy investment going into the tram. The city council has worked hard also together with the state. So I wouldn't want to call it the Keolis Downer success only. It's an overall success which we are a part of, and then the increases in patronage are in the double-digit figures in terms of which is very unusual in patronage, because you're above 10% in a year and a half on the increase in patronage. That is great news.
So how much freedom do you get to set timetables so that services meet each other, set the parameters of the service? Is that all set by government, or do you get freedom to innovate around those areas?
We get freedom to suggest, to put forward our proposals, and very often they are listened to, but the ultimate decision rests with the state, which will approve or not route changes, timetable adjustments, etc. Because again, as I said, they go to election, we go to tender. So we've got to demonstrate to them the value of the proposals that we make, both from a cost perspective as well as a revenue perspective, as well as a customer satisfaction perspective. To give you an example, in Newcastle, with the expected investment in the tram, and with a look at the bus routes as they were established, the bus routes hadn't been changed for decades. And those bus routes needed to change because population had moved, because working habits had changed, and because the tram was going to come up. So in the tender, we came up with a proposal of a redesign of the network, establishing some trunk lines which are clock-faced in their schedule, that is, people can see a bus like regularly every 10 or 15 minutes, whereas on the other routes it'll be less frequent. And the state was calling for such input from the bidders, which was only provided after thorough review of the population, its traveling habits, its expectations, etc. So you see, in the end, it's an ultimate, it's a collective process where the decision in the end rests with the funder, i.e. the Public Transport Authority.
Have you done that kind of thing in other cities around the world?
Oh yes, we've done it. Well, in fact, we started that process, which is one that we've been doing for like almost 10 years, is one that we had started, in fact, in Lyon, in France, where there's 100 bus lines, and there, with the construction of the metro, with the construction of the tramway, and also with the shifts in population, it was obvious that the bus lines as they existed could be optimized, and without putting more money into producing more kilometers, but by really looking how well, and we have a whole process, if you like, of looking at how a particular area is currently served, what is the potential patronage that it could have, and what is the difference between that potential patronage and its current usage. And there are some areas which we identify as being overserved, and certain areas which we understand as being underserved. And that thorough analysis allows us to come up with a redesign of the network, again keeping the same level of production, but through that, and it's been extremely successful in the cities where we've done it. So we do not increase costs. In fact, we reduce costs, but optimize the patronage in figures that are between 7, 8, 10, 15%, and great passenger satisfaction. Now, people have to get used to it. If you take the example of Lyon, we did the change in 2011. Overnight, we renumbered all the bus lines of the city. Big communication campaign, of course, all that in line with the Public Transport Authority for several months ahead. And overnight, everything was changed. And looking back now, we're delighted that it's happened so well. And we've done it in other cities. We've done it in Bordeaux. We're doing it in Lille. And therefore, we've offered it here in Newcastle, where it was called for. And it's... These things are always hard to sell to the public because, as you can imagine, people are like their traditional bus, and they need to understand the value of change, but they do.
You've got quite an interesting mix of those kinds of opportunities in Australia. In the Gold Coast, it's one line.
Mode.
In Melbourne, it's the entire tram network, and in Newcastle, it's all the public transport in the geographic area. Do you see any differences in how you're incentivized to make those improvements between those three networks?
Well, yeah, the contract models are very different from one to the other, i.e. on the Gold Coast, we're in a PPP, public-private partnership, so it's a long-term contract. And then we work within a consortium, an SPV that was formed with the construction company, with a rolling stock provider, etc. And that consortium is the one that deals with the state. In Yarra Trams, it's a contract where we just manage the tram network, but then we have an incentive on ridership, so on patronage. I would say. Our job is not to specify the type of contract that we're going to work on. In the same way as I've said, we are passenger-centric and mode agnostic. We are passenger-centric and contract type agnostic. We'll work in a PPP. We'll work in a growth contract. We'll work in a net contract. First things first, we need to listen to what the Public Transport Authority is looking for. Is it looking for the maximization of revenue? Is it looking for the maximization of patronage? Is it looking for reinvestment? And then come up with, if you like, the proposals that meet those expectations. And you do find very different environments. Some authorities are very financially constrained and really want to absolutely cut costs and possibly minimize service, etc. Others don't have the same obligation and absolutely need to, evolve and push their city into a new kind of environment. So there's no one size fits it all. The one size that fits all is, again, listening to the expectations and understanding what the needs are. We're lucky to work with about 300 cities in the world. So we've seen various types of expectations and work well with cities in designing what suits them.
I kind of implicit in Ilya's question is that it seems like from what you're saying, in France, there's sort of a dominant model that's emerged around working for the municipality, doing all of the transport within it. And Ilya's listed off 3 different models in Australia that all seem quite bespoke to the circumstance. I'm interested by, is that there must be a lack of efficiency in having all these different approaches for you as a contractor, have all these different models applied in Australia. Is that
having that variety of contracts requires agility, and at the same time, when we operate the trams in Melbourne, by DNA, we know that it is essential that we do not operate the trams in isolation, but that we operate the trams in conjunction with the metro and with the buses. The trams have, and people don't use one mode, they use several modes. So we don't manage the other modes, but it is our we are really morally obligated to work well with Metro and with the buses, and anyhow above us there is a public transport authority that acts as the conductor. Good news, having that experience of working all the modes in many cities, we know that transport in itself is not an end, it's a mean. And it's the mode itself is a mean to the greater fluidity, attractiveness, etc. of a city. So we are a cast member of a big play. We need to understand the big picture and work well with the other actors.
I mean, again, it is a unique position that Keolis has, being in so many jurisdictions around the world. Are there things that you like more in other jurisdictions that we could learn from here, and are there things that we could that Australia is doing particularly well that could be in those other jurisdictions?
Well, there's many things that Australia does very well, particularly.
I'm looking for that compliment sandwich.
Yeah.
You've got to start with the good one first, and then.
All right, I'll give you a couple of compliments, but they're easy to make. I.e., Australia and you guys play a big role in that, but I think really recognizes the importance of infrastructure and public transport infrastructure in its evolution. I was lucky to live in Sydney, almost 30 years ago. And the Sydney that I see today has nothing to do with the Sydney that I see that I saw then. And wow. So there's clearly an awareness of the country and of the states and of the cities of the need to evolve from a individual car usage as the sole mode of transportation. It has its merits, but it also has its limits. So on that, compliments to a country that has that view, puts money into it, in a governance which, sure, in absolute standards, if you look at them from here, may have their flaws, may have its flaws, but looking at what's happening in other countries is rather democratic in the choices that are made.
I have heard you say that before. I think you said there's an obsession here with self-flagellation of infrastructure delivery. Is it noticeably is there a noticeable self-hatred here that you don't see in other jurisdictions?
When it comes to self-flagellation on transport, Australia is not the only one. I see it, for example, in the UK also, where I see the UK investing heavily into Thameslink and Crossrail, and yet the projects may be delayed by a year or two.
I was going to say, it seems entirely normal to me. So I'm from the UK. There's always a constant beat up about this project being over, and then you get to Australia and it's in dollars, not pounds, but it's broadly the same conversation.
Yeah, but look, if you go back to the UK, people whining about Isambard Brunel being a year late on delivering trains to the west. Are people going to look back on, even here, are they going to look back on, I don't know, the tram here in Sydney as having been late? Yes, it's late, it's hard, etc. But in the end, 30 years, 40 years from now, people will enjoy the benefits of it. And that's why I find that self-flagellation is indeed, to a foreign visitor, a little surprising, because in relative terms, wow, there's so many countries that envy you.
So in the other countries that you operate in the Keolis international business, you don't see the same degree of focus on those time and cost blowouts that we hear about here?
Not necessarily in the same proportion or in a different way. We're lucky to operate, for example, in China with a great partner in Shanghai, with Shanghai Metro. Now, the Chinese are very good at keeping their schedules, but they do have challenges also, but you don't have the same level of self-flagellation as you have here. We operate in India, where also there have been drifts in various projects. But again, there, construction itself is hampered by, say, environmental constraints. You need to go to the environmental tribunal before you cut a tree. Well, you have to respect that, and it's called tradition and culture, and you're not judgmental on it. It has its impact, but it doesn't generate the same exasperation as it does here. Indeed, in this country, things are very public on costs, on timing, and people are used to voice their concerns. It's logical that they are, and that they do, and there's a free press that points things, and usually points to the flaws, perhaps a little more than to the benefits.
How do those
successes?
Because the thing that they usually point to is cost.
Mm-hmm.
How do those again? It's a unique position that Keolis is in to be able to compare those costs. How do the costs compare here to some of the other jurisdictions of comparable wealth?
Well, clearly the costs here are high.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt about that. They are high on construction. They are high on operation.
And if you take out wages, because that's not, wages are high here. That's what we have. If you take out wages, are other things also more expensive, or is it really just a function of people cost more here?
Well, in a staff-intensive activity such as ours, wages are, a bus operation, it's 65 to 70% of your costs. Wages are high, but there's a culture also of, the cost of material, which is imported as being high, but also the process itself. There's a rather stringent governance, a heavy contractual approach with strong legal input, which also is costly. The bids themselves are rather expensive.
But is the legal component and all these other components of a bid, are they having a material impact on your willingness to participate in the market, or how much risk you're willing to take on?
Yes, they do have an impact because, of course, bids are expensive in Australia. They are very expensive to run, and probably more expensive than in other countries. So
what can we do to that, though? Because that's something that's investigated quite a lot. Bid costs. I think IPA has even written a paper on bid costs at some stage.
Yeah, but they're the same for everyone. So if it's not deterring competition, then it's worthy of the question of is it as big an issue as it is made out to be? Would be my.
Well, indeed, they do not deter bidders at the moment to go for the bids. They are thrown back into the system.
Exactly.
Because,
we pay for it at some stage.
At some stage, indeed, they are paid for. There are avenues also to, if you like, simplify things or minimize litigations. One of the things that we have, which was born, I think, in Australia was around collaborative partnership, and how do you, through collaborative partnership, allow bigger projects to be designed with the ultimate goal in mind rather than the individual interests, and how do you minimize potential litigation by focusing on the ultimate goal in the big picture. This is a very positive approach that helps reduce legal costs, because then the partners are encouraged to go into let's have that broad view together, and let's find ways to avoid litigation as the project is delivered.
So which jurisdiction is the model? Where are we looking to? Who should we be copying?
I wish there was also one size that fits all. I'm not sure that there is the ultimate A-class type of environment. I think
Just to avoid bias, you have to pick one outside of France if you pick one.
Yes, indeed. No, but you have sound procurement models. I have observed, for example, take the UK with the rail franchising, which is under heavy criticism. I observe the rail franchising UK system in the UK, and despite all its flaws, I find that it has delivered on the increase in patronage, on safety, on the modernization of the network, on the capacity of the network in a constrained environment to carry more and more people. So yes, the process has its flaws, but it's regularly reviewed and altered. So I think it's much better than the image it has.
One of the problems is you can't prove the counterfactual. You can't say what it would have been like had British Rail still run.
Well, people love to talk about British Rail as a reference up to 1995. Well, I was lucky to, as a schoolboy, my parents sent me to England for a year when I was in a boarding school, and I remember taking the train regularly. That's a long way back, but British Rail wasn't a dream in terms of the delivery of service. So in relative terms, again, I look at the statistics of the rail delivery group in the UK, but look at what rail has delivered in the UK, and to me, overall, it is a success in both relative terms, i.e., from one year to the other in the UK, but also compared to other countries in Europe, be it Germany, France, etc. Not to take a French example.
We don't appear to have, as they do in the UK, one of the major parties talking about renationalising the railways. It seems here every time a franchising comes up for renewal, it's sort of accepted that it will be a franchise. It's just how deep or how much deeper that franchise will go than it did in the past. If you think to the Melbourne Rail, Yarra Trams, and we're even announcing new franchises in South Australia recently, and here in Sydney, the remaining parts of the bus network. Is there something we're doing different here that's driving greater depth of private sector involvement versus those places where maybe there's danger that the tide's coming back in?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I observe is that indeed there's not the same level of questioning here in Australia. It's always been a debate, but in the end, what people have observed, I believe, is that jobs have not been cut from those processes. And I remember in Sweden, to give you an example, we were operating these half of the buses in Stockholm from a company that was basically the local STA, i.e. Originally a state-owned or a city-owned bus company that was privatized and that we purchased. And then we won in Gothenburg a few years later a bid to run half of the buses also, and against this time the municipal company. And it struck me at the time when we were mobilizing for that new contract in Gothenburg that our union representatives on our board in Stockholm said, why are you worrying about convincing staff of this privatization? We will go and talk to our colleagues in Gothenburg, which they did. And they said, we will go and talk to them about what we've observed and what it's been like, i.e., a positive lesson. And they did go out to Gothenburg, and that mobilization went very well, and that transition happened very well, because people saw that they weren't going from the paradise of a municipal-run company to the hell of a privately owned company. We need people badly, whether we are publicly owned or privately owned. They run the operations daily. They have the same working hours. They need to reach out to passengers, and hopefully. I don't think anyone has seen in Australia that people have suffered from things being franchised.
What if industrial relations is one of the objectives of, I don't want to say privatization, but some kind of franchising contract? Would that be less appealing then for a bidder to take on as a responsibility if one of the goals is to resolve a challenging industrial relations environment?
No, the question is, we always come back to the same question. What is the agenda of the city? And if the city is keen on evolving its industrial relations and feels that change is going to be an accelerator of that evolution, and if it is so understood, well, we need to come up with the right processes, and you never work against the people, you work with them. Poor industrial relations usually prosper first on poor management. It's very easy to go out and blame the unions. It's quite convenient to say, they're awful, they're difficult, etc. But usually our experience of bad industrial relations is at our doorstep, i.e. when you now, and it takes years to evolve this, but if you are in a them and us mentality, in an antagonistic one, that's not something that is solved overnight. If we are faced with that sort of agenda, yes, these things are not solved overnight. They don't scare us. And believe me, if there is one thing that we do not try to export from France, it is the French industrial relations.
I was going to bring that up because if there's no better training ground for dealing with a challenging industrial relations environment than the than French transport, especially. I remember when they launched the driverless metro lines in Paris, someone asked him, so is this just to avoid protests? And he said, that's not what this is about. It's efficiency, it's safety. But yes, it's true. Line 1 and 14 are very unlikely to have strikes when affect their operations. And it's there are positive ways to deal with it, obviously, and there are combative ways to deal with it. And I guess so you're saying it is something that you would. It's not something that would scare you off from a potential contract or anything like that, but it's also not something that's necessarily ideal to be associated with any franchising. Maybe that's
it, yeah. And Australia and France have one thing in common, which is a history of challenging industrial relations. And as I said, I was in shipping in Australia, which is not known to be a sector particularly easy in its industrial relations. Your summary is absolutely the good one. It doesn't scare us off. And then at the same time, if it is the issue that has to be one of the strong issues in a particular network that have to be taken on, then we look at it and we work with the unions on making things evolve, and with the cities, of course.
One of the other things that sometimes franchising is used for is to inject innovation or new technologies into systems. We heard here in New South Wales, the government announced that it would franchise the remaining buses, but also introduce over time a fully electric bus fleet. You operate some electric or hydrogen buses around the world?
More and more. Well,
and could you talk to us about how's that different from an operational perspective? What are the challenges? What's emerging? What's the future?
It's very interesting because it's a big trend, particularly in Europe, and well, even more so in China. I think a city like Shenzhen has 22,000 electric buses already. And in Europe, we are currently on several tenders. We have just last month won a big tender in central Holland, IJsselweert, to run 300 electric vehicles. We have just won another one in Bergen for 160 electric buses. Now, several challenges around that. First, you don't run a bus, you run a system. And so as an operator, you need to approach it not from the angle of just the bus itself, but basically, where is your depot? Where is it on the grid? Is the grid allowing you to get the sort of power that you need for charging? What about what sort of charging are you going to go for? Are you going to go for opportunity charging, or are you going to go for overnight depot charging? And what impact does that have on your drivers? And on your rostering, and then of course the if you like, the skills on maintenance are very different between a thermal engine and an electric one. Challenges on the financing also. What battery life are you going to have? What sort of residual value are you going to have for the buses that you buy?
Have they? But from a total life cycle cost, have they reached parity with diesel buses, or it still requires some kind of subsidy?
Well, they have. Our experience is that they have not yet reached parity with thermal engines, with regular buses, but they are coming down, and the two are coming closer to one another. But then you see also that the very and you're talking about subsidies. Public transport is
everything
rarely,
requires a subsidy.
Yeah. Subsidies are part of the economic model of the industry. But then suddenly you can do things with an electric bus that you wouldn't do with a regular bus. So we have that line in Stockholm where the bus stops in the library itself because it's an electric bus, and so you can come up with innovations that you wouldn't have thought of, and so you can think outside of the box.
So are they coming to you and saying we want electric buses, or are they just putting out a bus tender and Keolis says, well, we could do an electric bus and have all these features?
And I'm going to ask a second part to that question, which is, who's deciding hydrogen or electric?
Well, two good questions, really. In the end, it's always the city or the PTA that will make the final decision because they have to foot that bill, and it is a political decision. Now, in a bid, we're in some situations invited to offer alternatives, and then we can come up with alternative A, alternative B, and highlight the pros and cons of the alternatives we bring up. As for hydrogen buses, the hydrogen buses is still, well, first, very rare, and the cost of the system is still far greater than the electric one. The figures that we hear are that around 20% of the fleets of electric buses could be hydrogen ones tomorrow. And hydrogen, in the end, is another way to store electricity.
I consider them both to be electric buses. It's just one, the storage is in a battery, one it's in hydrogen.
That's it. And you know, the price of hydrogen is suddenly going to go down. But again, it's horses for courses, and what sort of benefits is the city or the state looking at? What sort of subsidies are being thrown? We feel that Australia there has a lot of potential because we sense a high level of interest. Perhaps things haven't gone as far or as fast as in other countries for obvious reasons, but we sense a high level of interest these days. For electric buses.
For electric, covering both hydrogen
Correct.
and battery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. And in the buses, the networks that you are operating with electric buses, are you finding that they're able to deliver the same sort of longevity of routes, and you're getting enough kilometres out, like those kind of sort of more practical day-to-day challenges?
Yes, they do. The service level they can provide is really high and very pleasant indeed. As a passenger, when you ride an electric bus, and for the driver also, by the way, which is important. But it's noise-wise and acceleration-wise, etc. It has many positive features. Now, the big challenges come from the topography, i.e., are you on the flat or a hilly section? What sort of air conditioning are you going to have, and what sort of temperature are you going to find? So the performance is really one that varies depending on lines and depending on the circumstances.
But so all these contracts that Adrian mentioned before, they're coming up in Australia. Are we likely to see, unless it's explicitly requested, are we likely to see the companies like Keolis saying, here's an electric bus solution, it might cost you a little bit more, or is it still just too far out there that it really needs to be, the government will really need to say, we want electric buses?
I feel that the impulse will really need to come from the government's call.
Yeah. Okay.
At this stage, yeah.
So I guess we're kind of in the present time now. I think we also want to pick your brain a little bit about what's coming up in the future. Again, because of Keolis's unique crystal ball. So what do you think the sort of major developments will be in public transport that you're seeing coming up over the kind of medium term, both in terms of the contracting and also maybe technological developments that we will see on the ground in the next decade or two?
Well, I see, great developments coming up. That is, there is a universal need for mobility, and be it demography, be it economic growth, be it environmental concerns. People need mobility, and
it's a very important term, that mobility. That people aren't talking about transport necessarily anymore. And I saw even on Keolis's website that they're talking about micro mobility, e-scooters and stuff like that. It's a new paradigm.
Well, and that new paradigm is fueled by great innovations like take digital already, which is the fuel to great productivity achievements, information capabilities. Really, yesterday, perhaps, public transport was probably more a curse than a choice, i.e. you really had no alternative and you had to be treated like cattle on the train where you're going to be squeezed, go from A to B, and tomorrow you'll have the option. First, you'll be treated not as an anonymous piece of cattle, but as an individual, because you'll be recognized as Joe, Jane, etc., and you have these preferences, etc. You'll have far better information on alternatives, and you can decide to walk today, you can decide to ride tomorrow, you can decide to ride share, you can decide to be on a scooter, you can decide to be on a bicycle.
And what's Keolis' role in all of that? Because we hear a similar thing from Uber, that they don't really care if it's ride share, e-bike, plane, whatever. They just want to be the either the booker or sometimes even the operator of that service. Does Keolis see itself in the same position?
Well, we see ourselves as, if you like, first, we're not everything to everybody, but what we are used to is dealing with public entities who are, and one is talking, when it comes to mobility, also about the sharing of space in general, and the decisions on the sharing of space have to come from a sort of an arbitrator of how that space is shared. Uber at the moment that you're referring to is being challenged by TfL because they have apparently tried to take them on or take the hard line and show them that they were perhaps stronger than the city. Well, the city is telling them that no, the city retains the right to make that choice. Now, we as Keolis are used to dealing with these public entities and listening to what their goals are.
There's another interesting development in light rail that there's discussion, and look, I'll be honest, I don't fully understand it. People are talking about a trackless tram, which to me sounds like a bus. Is it a bus? Is it going to come and replace our light rails soon? Does Keolis have them? What do you think of the whole trackless tram suggestion?
Oh, the trackless tram has been in existence for many years, and there was a.
You mean since buses, or is it a?
No. Trams. There was a trams on tires. Which was manufactured, well, in fact, in Clermont-Ferrand, the city of Michelin, the tire manufacturer. The tram was a tram on tires.
The Paris Metro runs on tires.
Oh, several lines. Yeah, but in Lyon we also have you do have a few. Well, it's.
But they're on a track.
Yeah, they're on the track, but they're on tires. Some of our Lyon lines are on the tires also. So it works on. If you like, it's an interesting development now. The trackless tram. One of the benefits of trams is for people to see. Well, with the tracks, they know where it goes.
Yeah,
and it makes it. It is one of the positive features. It'll be interesting to see. These trackless inverted commas trams, yet because of their size and because of the number of options is not going to be multiplied by 10. So
it doesn't come through on audio, but based on your facial expression, I'm detecting a degree of skepticism of the trackless tram concept as replacing all the light rails around.
Yeah, perhaps I'm too much of a dinosaur and I need to be convinced, but I don't know. If you like, our experience of the trams on tires that we have seen in Clermont-Ferrand in France, or our experience of semi-trackless trams like we saw them in Nancy or in Caen, has been one of replacement by trams on tracks.
Fixed tracks,
right? On fixed tracks.
What about one of the, I guess they can be considered a competitor, is MTR. The Hong Kong arrangement lets them be much more involved in developing the value around a station than they are allowed to be in other jurisdictions. Do you see more of a role for public transport operators like Keolis and MTR in doing that kind of thing in other jurisdictions?
We see our job more as, if you like, being able to highlight that value creation and offer ways to ensure that value creation helps develop the network. We're not in models ourselves where we are developers of commercial or residential properties from that. We see how successful it's been in some places, but at the same time, we've also seen the resistance of some cities feeling that this was a prerogative which was theirs and that they were not keen to let go of. So it's not a field in which we have into which we've moved.
Okay.
So Bernard, earlier on you said about a couple of years in the Navy, and I was just interested to understand. So you were down in submarines, or what was the?
No, I did dive several times when I was in the submarine forces, luckily, but I was more in headquarters and in staff. So I did dive on diesel submarines as well as nuclear submarines. And I'm delighted to see that France and Australia are developing that great partnership over the 12 submarines that are going to be built in Adelaide. A show of, particularly having lived that period of strain of the relationship between the two countries, feeling that the level of confidence is such now that, the last submarine, I think, will be delivered in 2035, and it'll probably be at sea until 2085. So you have 60 years of collaboration, because you need the supply chain for that manufacturing to happen. You need the confidence between the two countries for those skills to be exchanged and developed. So I find it's great news, and it brings me back to that period with emotion, because submariners are a great category of people. Those who go at sea in those on those boats are work well together.
I think nuts is the best way to describe them. 3 months underwater in a tube is I think you have to have something a little bit off to be comfortable with that. I'm amazed that people can do it. Is that you were in the nuclear subs that were there for that long?
Well, you see people there who are considerate of one another. They live in a very constrained environment, and they live a hard thing, but they live it together. So that's it's and they understand the purpose of which is a common purpose, and it drives them. So it's a strange environment, if indeed not common. But Australia has a strong history of good skilled submarine forces and a good skilled navy, and I'm delighted for the country that it's investing in its navy as it is.
With the passion I've seen you speak about this, I get the feeling that Keolis are going to go into operating submarines next.
No, we just operate ferries at the moment in Newcastle, and we love that. And then, they're doing a great job. But I was on the ferries in Newcastle with pleasure, talking to the skipper and the crew, and seeing what a good job they do.
So you're getting back to shipping then? Now
absolutely, yes. Well, ferries and river transport, etc., is one of the features of mobility, an appealing one. And hey, Sydney is a good proof of that.
A good spot for it with the harbour.
Yeah.
We've asked all of our guests the same question at the end of the interviews. So I'm going to ask the same to you, which is, what's your favourite sort of infrastructure and why?
I really like I'm very fond of, because I was lucky to run the network in Lyon for a few years, which has both trams, metros, buses, etc. And I really enjoyed very much operating the driverless metros that we have, because I observed how we were able to inject capacity at very short notice, how we were able to deliver a great service to passengers, because the regularity of the service was extremely high, because the kids could go in the front and look at how the service was running, and I could see its hours of operation also being easily extended. So I felt that it was technologically quite amazing, bringing straight and great benefits to passengers in terms of safety, on-time performance, etc. So it's rather expensive, but it's one of my preferred modes then in the field of those we operate.
Most people that we've asked that question of go to maybe the built form, or they like tunnels when they're being constructed because they're maybe an engineer by background. It's interesting you went to something that's it's not really to do with the transport or the infrastructure, it's the customer. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that you focus on there, is actually the school kids being at the front of the train.
He's not an engineer, he went to business school, so it's
right. But also remember, our motto is think like a passenger, and I am full of admiration for all the technical skills that go into designing the marvels that we operate. But in the end, their only purpose is to satisfy passengers, and happy passengers make happy cities, and cities that thrive and move forward. So again, think like a passenger for us is not just a concept. It's something that we go back to. And so one of the good modes to achieve this is a driverless metro. But luckily, there's many others, and we'll keep operating them with pride and joy.
Well, that seems like a great note to finish on. Bernard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
That's it for today. Thanks as always to PwC Australia for their continued sponsorship and hosting of the series. Please make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to Inside Infrastructure and leave us a rating or a comment on LinkedIn. If you have any guest suggestions, then please feel free to send us those either to Ilya or myself. We've certainly appreciated the messages we've been receiving so far. This episode was recorded and edited by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC Australia's internal media agency. Research was conducted by Linda Bergerson, Michael Player and Brendan Pearce.